How about now? Can people hear me now? Okay, apologize. I'm going to start this over since people can hear me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start over. If most people couldn't hear me, I apologize for that. But here we go. Okay, welcome to the Chapter 5 discussion chapter, statistics solutions. If you have questions along the way, you can ask them certainly, but I won't be able to get them to them till the end. Okay, and at the end also we'll have more contact information, phone numbers, email addresses. Okay. Okay, so basically what we're going to cover are the general components of the discussion chapter. I always encourage everybody to get a hold of their school's specific template if they have one, because there are particulars that certain schools want. But generally, what we're including today are the components. Okay. Introduction. The introduction serves to reorient your reader to what your study was about, right? You're just going to kind of reorient them, restate the purpose of your study. Why was your study necessary to conduct? Why was it important to conduct? Again, just to remind the reader of those things. You can also preview contents of the chapter, the sections that are going to be coming up. So, nice brief introduction to kind of remind the reader of the purpose and the importance. The interpretation of the findings. This is really the core of the discussion chapter, and it involves really when the term interpretation is used, it's not really kind of your own interpretation, although it involves that a little bit. Really what you're doing here is setting up a discussion of how your findings relate to the findings of previous literature. Okay, so a good way to organize this section, a very reader-friendly way and a very writer-friendly way also to organize this section is by your research questions, if it's quantitative, or by your themes, if it's qualitative. And in the case of mixed methods, we'll get to a little later, which is pretty much the same, but at some point you're going to have a section that kind of synthesizes the two different findings. So for example, quantitative, the first section, start off with your first RQ and its hypothesis, restated, and then just very concisely summarize your finding on that, whether the hypothesis was supported or not. Then bring in findings on that that you covered in Chapter 2, your lit review, and discuss whether what you found supports major findings in that area, or your findings don't support major findings in that area. If your findings do support previous research, you can make conclusions based on those, right? Because now that your findings have supported previous findings, you can make conclusive statements. If your findings don't confirm the findings of previous research, that's fine. I mean, you know, as an objective researcher, you get what you get, but it still tells us something. So in the cases where your findings may not support previous research, it's appropriate to offer an explanation of why your findings may not have supported or aligned with previous research. Sometimes it involves the population, a sample, you know, you're looking at a different population, a different group of people. There can be various explanations, but you should try to offer an explanation of the difference. Similar idea for qualitative, just base the subsections here on your themes, lay out your first theme, summarize what you found, and then again, bring in some of the major research from chapter 2 on the topic and start a discussion of where and how your findings support previous research and what that can tell us. Again, findings that are different, offer an explanation. Also, if you found anything new or if there's anything novel to your findings, you definitely want to mention that. And that will serve as a good basis later for recommendations for further research, but we'll get there in a minute. Okay, let's see. Okay, do not make conclusions. Okay, again, that's the core of the chapter, really. And again, it involves that bringing in the other research to see how your findings confirm or do not confirm. Okay. Limitations. Some schools want a separate limitation section. Some schools, they don't care. They just want you to note the limitations somewhere, usually in the discussion in the previous section. But you do need to note any limitations of your study. Limitations are not really challenges. I mean, if you had some challenges like, well, I didn't think I could interview a certain group of people, but I ended up being able to, you don't need to mention that really, because that's just a challenge. Limitations are really shortcomings or weaknesses that actually may have affected your results. So for quantitative studies, a major limitation is low sample size. That means you didn't get enough people to sample to achieve statistical certainty. So that weakens your findings. For qualitative, sometimes it's you can't get the people that you wanted to interview. You have to interview like a proxy population, or maybe you don't even get enough people in that case. But you just need to explain your limitations and how they may have affected your results. Usually it's not a very long section. You also want to discuss the generalizability of your findings to the larger population, meaning, does what you found, can it be applied to others in the larger population? And usually for quantitative studies, if they're sufficiently powered, which means they have an ample sample size, quantitative studies typically generalize well. Qualitative studies do not generalize well, and that's really kind of an accepted limitation. It's worth noting in your limitations, if you have a qualitative study, that because of the low sample size, necessarily low, usually 8, 10, 12 people to interview, because qualitative research is designed to gather in-depth information that you can only collect by interviewing a small group of people. So typically the findings don't generalize well, and that's okay. That's what you're sacrificing. You're sacrificing that in-depth information for generalizability. But usually it's worth mentioning that in the limitation section for qualitative studies. Implications for practice, not a long section, but important, because kind of this is part of what your study has been leading to, is being able to make solid, sound statements about how your study can affect what it means for practitioners, what it means for people at the practice level, and in the later section, what it means for further research. So implications for practice are just like they sound. How might your findings inform people at the level of practice? How might they inform the professionals or the stakeholders in the area that you're talking about? Okay, and you can be as specific as possible here. If it involves, for example, if it's teachers and professional development, like the professional development is important. Well, how do you get that? What does it mean? Does it mean having seminars to professionally developed teachers? Does it mean giving incentives to them, administration giving incentives so they can do things like go to conferences to help professionalize themselves? So at the level of practice, you can be specific, right? So just think about it as if you had to tell somebody, it's your job, well, here's what I did my study on. Well, what did you find? How can that help us? It's really kind of concrete steps that how what you found can inform what you do. Okay, and recommendations for further research. Another important kind of something that stems from your actual findings, like the recommendations for practice, the recommendations for future research should be based on your findings. In other words, they're not general recommendations. Same things with practice. They're not general recommendations for practice. They're not general recommendations for further research. They're based on what you found. So if you found, for example, if your findings in some area don't align with the findings of previous research, you can recommend more research on that area because it suggests a degree of inconclusiveness. If you found something that is new, obviously, you can recommend more research on that because it's it's something that came up in your study. Recommendations can also be based on limitations. So if you did conduct a quantitative study and you didn't get enough people, and your sample size was low and that affected your results, you can recommend that researchers replicate the study but include a larger ample sample size. So the recommendations can be based on limitations. The recommendations would be just to conduct the same study and address whatever limitations there were in your study. You can also recommend different types of studies designed to collect different types of data. So if you conducted a quantitative study, you can recommend further qualitative study on the topic to get kind of more in-depth information about it. You can recommend something like case studies, which have multiple data collection. They collect data from multiple sources, usually interviews, sometimes observation, records. And what case studies help do is get a more comprehensive view of the topic because it comes at it from several angles. If you conducted a qualitative study and you found some things that are fairly significant as far as constructs or ideas, you could recommend quantitative study to kind of empirically or to quantitatively test those constructs or ideas. And a different type of study too is a longitudinal study. These are studies designed to collect data over time with multiple data collection points over time, and those are good for things, dynamic issues that may change or have kind of ins and outs over time. So if you recommend a different type of study, for example, which is good, just be sure to give a little bit of information about what kind of information those studies can give us that your study didn't yield. Okay, and summary. Check with your template again. Some schools let you end at the recommendations for further research. They don't really want a conclusion or a summary, so that's good. If your school does want a summary or conclusion, right? It's like the conclusion of any other chapter in some ways, but another way it's a little different because it's concluding your whole dissertation. So a couple of things, just recap the major points from your chapter. right? And then leave the reader with a take-home message, or leave them with the most important aspects of your study that you want them to remember. The most important findings that you want them to remember. Make a case for your study. What it's added to our understanding of the topic. Okay, and that is it for the presentation. I'm happy to take questions now. This is our information here. You'll see on the slide, contact information, email address, phone number, and it's a free, if you think you're interested in our services or you want to learn more about what we offer, it's a free 30-minute consultation, and you can find out more. Apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning, which means human error. But does anybody have any questions? I'm happy to answer any questions. You're limited to one free 30-minute consultation. Yeah. I mean, anything can probably be worked out in that time. That's probably enough to give you an idea of what we do, or if we can help you out. Let me see, you got some other questions here. Let's see. How long should the chapter be on average? It depends. I'm going to give you a ballpark figure, but again, they're ballpark figures. There's no requirement unless your school has a page length requirement. A quantitative discussion chapter can be anywhere from, I'd say 10 to 12 pages is probably the average, anywhere from 8 to 15 pages. Qualitative discussion chapter, probably anywhere between 10 and 20 pages, because the themes take a little more time to kind of hash out. And also you may have, 5, 6, 7, 8 themes. So yeah, rough number for quant, 10 to 12, for qual, 15, 10 to 20. Is it appropriate to make inferences in qualitative studies like this? Seems more prominent than older. Inferences in qualitative studies. Yeah, you can certainly make conclusions based on the data. If what you found confirms, especially the findings of previous research, you can make conclusions. Now, there's certain things you can't say. It depends on what you really ask, but you can't make kind of causal, cause and effect kind of statements and things like that. But you can make conclusions and inferences, yeah. Or, say that the data suggests or the data indicates. Okay, can you elaborate on the organization of the chapter for mixed methods? Yeah, let's go back for mixed methods. There's not much difference except in the interpretation of the findings section. We don't see a lot of mixed method studies, but generally, do you want to cover both sets of findings, right? And if it's easier to do that in a separate section for the quantitative and a separate section for the qualitative, that's fine. But I think at some point, maybe in yet a third section, you will want to synthesize those findings and just kind of discuss how they corroborate or not one another, how they serve to give you an overall picture. So I would probably have an interpretation section for each, and again, some kind of synthesis section where you talk about them in a relationship with one another. Or, you know, if you don't want to have the third section, you will have to do some kind of synthesis of the findings in both of those sections, in the qual part and the quant part. For word count for the discussion, maybe limitations. Yeah. Again, they kind of go back to the page count question, which I answered. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, word counts, and again, unless your school has a specific template, some of these sections aren't very long. The longest one is probably the interpretation of the findings section, a few pages. I mean, like the limitation section, if you don't have major limitations. You know, if you don't have major limitations, it may not be too long. Like a limitation section could be less than a page. Things like recommendations for practice, recommendations for further research. I mean, they could be several pages. They could be a page. So it's all dependent. But usually the sections aren't typically long. Again, the whole chapter can be anywhere from 8 pages to 20 pages. Again, depending on whether you're quantitative or qualitative. Sorry, let me read the questions a little more distinctly so we can all benefit from that. If a limitation in the current chapter article is addressed in a different and later chapter article, do I pretend that it isn't? I'm not really sure what that's asking. I mean, if you in chapter 1, I think there's, or chapter 3, maybe both. There's a limitation section where you discuss potential limitations that you might anticipate before you collect data, and then this limitations in chapter 5 is really what you're discussing, what actually really represented limitations, which the things you talked about in 1 and 3, which may represent potential limitations. They may have occurred, they may not have occurred. Let me say, we've got some other questions here. What are some common mistakes I see with discussion sections? That's a good question. The most common mistake I see with discussion chapters is that people don't know what to do, and so they end up copying and pasting material from their chapter 4. Don't do that. Number one, don't copy and paste anything, because professors frown on that. They see it as intellectually lazy. The only thing, I have an asterisk here, the only thing you're expected to copy and paste are things like your research questions, because they don't change, and your purpose statement, because your purpose doesn't change. Those things you can copy and paste when you need to, but they're very small components. But yeah, don't just kind of take material out of chapter 4 and put it in the 5. I mean, if you are repeating something or you need to make something clear, that's fine. But the chapter 4 focuses on the results and the statistics, or the codes if you're doing qualitative. And that material is largely out of chapter 5. And chapter 5 should be a plain spoken chapter. You can include some statistics, but it's usually not statistics heavy. So that's the most common mistake I see, that people just don't know what to include in the 5. So things like this, the webinar, talk to your chair, looking at your school's template, looking at examples of approved dissertations, all these things are good to prepare you for what to expect in the chapter 5. So you don't kind of make a mistake like that and get stuck and you're not sure what to put in it and just kind of repeat material from chapter 4. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, everybody's going to be sent a copy of the presentation. For mixed methods, do I need to include qualitative hypothesis? I have 3. I'm sorry. For mixed methods design, do I need to include a qualitative hypothesis? I have 3 research questions, 1 qualitative and 2 quantitative questions. No, qualitative, research questions do not have hypotheses. So you would not include a hypothesis for your qualitative question. Did I cover all the questions? If you have another question, just send it in. For quality, let me see. Can we talk more about limitations? Do you mind going back to that slide? Not at all. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you want to talk about limitations. I mean, I really covered what I know there. It's a discussion of anything that may have posed serious shortcomings or weaknesses to your study that may have affected the results. And you usually want, they want you to talk about the generalizability of your results also. I covered those things. If there's something more specific you want me to cover, let me know. For qualitative, is there such a thing as too many themes? No, I don't think so. I haven't heard of it. I mean, yeah, I've never heard of that. I mean, I've seen, you know, qualitative studies with lots of themes, 8 themes, 10 themes. Sometimes they have sub themes, but I don't know what too many is exactly. So I'm not sure about that, but I've never seen too many. I've seen a lot, like I said, 10 themes. That's kind of a lot. When is research too old to use? When it's not relevant anymore. Again, let's go to your templates, your school templates. Some schools really care about the recency of the research that you use. They'll want research published within 5 years of your anticipated year of graduation. Some schools want 5 to 7, some schools want 10, some schools don't care. So really check your template, ask your chair if you're not certain. My general rule of thumb is you want to keep things pretty recent because, you know, things that research that was conducted 20 years ago was conducted 20 years ago. Unless it's foundational or theoretical somehow, and there's a reason to include it, you should probably stay away from it. I mean, things have changed, especially statistics, numbers. I mean, why do you want statistics from 20 years ago? Also, things that weren't studied or covered 20 years ago may have been studied or covered in that time. So it's always best to stay as recent as you can, unless there's, again, some reason to go to a foundational or an earlier theoretical source. Okay, any more questions? And again, you will all be receiving a copy of this. All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And we run these all the time. Just check our calendars on different aspects of methods and non-methods components like this as well. So thank you for attending, and happy holidays.